All right, so this week we are we're creating functions within our Python code. And this is something we started on more towards the beginning of the semester, where we did some pseudocoding where we created a main module, and we decided that a main module is where all program coding programs begin. And then in our main module, we made some calls to some other modules that were basically self-contained. They were independent. They worked independently of each other. They were sort of self-contained little units of code that kind of kept things organized and kept our thought process separated. So we're going to take this concept of modules to Python, where we're actually going to create modules, if you will, or we're going to call them functions that do, just like our modules did here, self-contained individual tasks. So I'm going to delete this because we've already talked about it. And so the purpose of this code then is to learn Lean. Let's do learn to create functions. All right, so let's get started. So the very first thing I'm going to do is show you how to create we called it modules in pseudocode, but I'm going to call them functions in Python. So we use this word def for define, and then we're going to give it a name. We're going to give this particular, just like you did your modules got a name. So we're going to call this name, I'm going to just give it the name of greeting. And for reasons we'll see in another video, we're going to follow this with an open and closed parenthesis. For right now, just sort of take it at face value, that in order to create this function, I need an open and enclosed parentheses with nothing in it. And then just like we did in our if conditions, our if blocks or our loops, we're going to end this statement with a semicolon, which means that the code that follows it is going to be indented, and everything that is indented is part of this function. So let's do something like print hello world. That seems like it's always appropriate for a greeting. Let's not do hello world. Let's just do hello. Oh, I know. I'm going to do something a little bit different just to kind of give you another way of doing things. And there, right here in my input, I'm going to put, what is your name? Can you do that all on the same sentence? Same statement? Yes, I can, because I just did. Okay, so now what we've done is created a function that doesn't do anything until somewhere in our code calls or invokes, is another word we use, this function. In other words, right now, if I run this and I run it, I don't get any errors, but I also don't get any output. So this print statement never got executed because it's in a module or a function that never was called. Well, how do you call it? Well, that's very simple, believe it or not. On the same line, the same far left, flush to the far left, I'm going to type the word greeting, which is the name of the function I want to run. And then I just match those open and closing parentheses. Again, take this at face value. For now, there's actually things that go in those parentheses, but we'll worry about that on another video. So what happens then is greeting is a call to this function. So as soon as the Python compiler sees the word greeting and then it's followed by a parenthesis, it knows that there's a function somewhere with this name, and it goes to that function. It found it here, and then it'll execute all the lines of code that are indented in that block. So let's run it and see what happens. And sure enough, what is your name got printed. What happens if I put this call to the greeting above? Oops, I probably made the whole thing. Above. Let's just see what happens. So I put the call to the greeting first. In other words, does order matter? So I put the call to the greeting and then I define the greeting. Let's see if that causes us an error. Oh, named greeting is not defined on line 5. So yes, that's true. I have to make sure that before I call it, just like we can't set a variable to a value unless we've already kind of declared it and got it prepared for us, kind of the same thing. So the little compiler then, if it's reading our line of code, remember it ignores comments, comes down and says, oh, there's a function here, but I don't do anything with it yet, so I'm going to keep going. This line is skipped because it's not being called yet. We go down to greeting. Greeting says, the compiler says, oh, I've got to go run that function called greeting. It finds the function, executes whatever lines are in that function, and then returns back to wherever it got called, which was here. And so whatever then is on the next line, let's say print I am after the greeting, let's just say. So now you'll see that this print statement will print after this statement because we're going to run the greeting first. Let's just see it. Okay, so what is your name? My name is Kirsten. And it printed hello Kirsten, and then we came back after the greeting and printed whatever was after the greeting. Wow, that's fantastic. Are we done yet? Oh, no, we haven't even started yet. All right, so now we're getting the idea where we can, I'm going to eliminate this for the moment, where we can call, could I put more lines of code here? Absolutely, if I wanted to. We could put print, welcome to my program. Okay, so obviously you can, just like in an if statement, you could put lots of blocks of code there. Okay, if you recall, however, at one point in time in our lives, we decided that, or we talked about that the main is always the first block of, the first module or the first block of code that's executed or supposed to be executed, and we don't have a main here. So I'm going to define a main, def, define this function. I'm going to call it main. Put those open and close parentheses, the colon, and I want greeting to be run from within main. So it turns out that Python doesn't really care about a module called main. Lots of other languages do, and so therefore I want you to get into the practice of creating this main function that is going to be our controller, that's going to execute, be in charge of all of the other things that get run and in what order. So I'd like you to get into the habit of creating this, although, as you saw a moment ago, I didn't need the main in order for our program to run. But let's do it just for good practice. So remember now, will this run? Let me see. It's not going to run because, of course, I've never called main yet, and so we need to create a call to main. Oops, there we go. So now everything is going the way we had intended. Main is, remember, the compiler is going to just realize it's got a function named greeting. It realizes it has a function named main. It's not going to run either of those yet. It hits this statement which says, all right, go ahead and run the main. The main will run. Hits greeting. Greeting comes up to this line. It says I'm the function named greeting. I'm supposed to print something. I'm supposed to print something else. And then I'll return back to where I came from, which was here, and execute any lines of code that followed afterwards. Whew, that's a mouthful. Okay, so let's keep expanding on this idea. So we're creating functions that are self-contained. In other words, this function's name is greeting, and it kind of gives you a clue what the code in this function is supposed to be doing. It sounds like it's creating a greeting of some type. And that's the only job of this function. I'm not doing anything else. I'm not doing calculations. This is just responsible for getting the greeting out to the user. All right, let us create a program. I think what we'll do is we'll create a program. Let me write it up here so you can see it. Create a program that presents options for what to do today. Let the user, let's do user, choose an option, and then depending on the option, display appropriate output. Okay, so what we're going to do then is, looks like I have to create a program that presents options for what to do today. So it sounds to me like that would be a great candidate for a menu type thing. In other words, would you like to choose number 1 to do this or select number 2 to do that? So what I'm going to do is create a new function. I'm going to call this function, let's see, we'll call this function menu. That would be a good idea. So we're going to create a menu. So remember, define, there's the name of this particular function, opening and closing parentheses. followed by the colon. And now we're going to present a menu to our users. I already have one done, so I'm just going to copy and paste it in just to save a little bit of video time. Just the stuff you've seen before. So print, what would you like to do today? They can choose 1 to play video games or choose 2 to go to a movie. Okay? And then we have our to-do variable, which is getting some input from our user. Now, normally we've been declaring variables, but I'm purposely not declaring any variables right now because it will work, because there's this whole concept about variables that we're going to talk about later. But for the moment, we know that this will work, and we'll discuss how to declare our variables in the next video. Okay, so now we're going to, I want to make sure this is working. So just to do something simple for now, just so I know that my code is working. Remember, it's always a good idea to test your code in small snippets to make sure it's running. So let's see, probably need to call my menu, and remember that the main is our controller. So this is going to keep track of who does what when. So after our greeting is finished printing, we'd like to run our menu. So I'm going to type in menu next with the parenthesis, which makes a call to menu, and that should then display these things and print out the to-do that was chosen. So let's go ahead and run that and make sure it works. What is your name? It's Kirsten. Hello, Kirsten, which is what was here. And then it printed welcome to my program, which was here. And then it executed that. It left greeting. It came back here. And it should have run the menu, which printed what are you going to do today. So it looks like it's doing things in the order that I expected. I'm going to play a video game. So let's just see if, I think maybe I messed it up by messing over here. So let's run it again. Okay, what is your name? Kirsten. And what would you like to do today? I'm going to choose 1, and it output 1. So that looks good. So things are working so far, and I need to figure out what to do with that 1. All right. Well, let's see. If they choose 1, then we need to do something about a video game. And if they choose 2, we need to do a movie. Well, let's see. That kind of sounds like 2 different tasks to me. The video games is going to be very different than going to a movie. So I think what I'll do is I'm going to create another, well, let's see. Does order matter here? Does it matter if I put these in the right order or in the same order? Let's mix these up before I make some new ones and see if it matters. So let's run that and see if the same thing happens. What is my name? I'll just be K, and I'll choose 2. So everything is still working. So what I'm trying to display to you here is that it doesn't really matter what order you lay these definitions out, because the main thing that matters is that we call our main after we've created the main. So our call is always being called after we've defined that particular function, and that these are in the order in the main in which I wish for them to be executed. So as long as those are in the right order and we've defined them ahead of time, then we're okay to mix these particular definitions up. If you want to just sort of keep it in order because it makes sense to you, well, that seems like it would be more efficient. So greeting, menu, and then what would be next? Well, now I'm creating this, I'm going to create a function that will happen if they choose video games. So definition, video games, and maybe if they're playing video games, I'm going to print, wouldn't you prefer to go to a movie? I'm not much of a video game player myself, so since this is my program, I can put whatever I want. Okay, and then let's make one for movies. And maybe in the movies, we can print something like, did you know Star Wars is coming out in December? I don't know if you're excited about that. A lot of Star Wars fans out there. There we go. Okay, so now we're setting up, we're putting into place some functions that we can call that will do different things, sort of independent upon each other. So I don't need this print statement anymore. I know that it's working, so I'm just going to delete that. And so now it sounds like, what do we need? I'm guessing we need an if statement. So if they choose to do is 1, then we need to call the video games. Otherwise, if they choose 2, we need to call the movies. Okay, so let's give that a whirligig. All right, so again, I have this code someplace else, and to save time, I'm just going to copy and paste it here. And we have exactly that. If to do is equal to, remember the double equals, is equal to 1. Go ahead and call this video game. Games. I have to make sure that those are spelled the same. Call the video games. Otherwise, call movies. Okay. Now, wait a minute. Let me just make sure that we understand here. I'm calling these functions from within a different function than the main. Can I do that? Absolutely, you can do that. You don't have to call everything from the main. Just remember that main is sort of keeping us in track, making sure that we do things in the right order. And so let's just kind of see what would happen. Let's walk through this in our minds to figure out, to make sure we understand how this is being called, how these things are being generated. So if I were the program and I were to run this menu, I'm going to start here, run the menu. Then the little compiler comes up and says, I found a function named menu. I'm supposed to print something. I'm supposed to print something. I'm supposed to print something. I'm going to get a value. Let's say that user put in 1. So the little compiler says, if to do equals 1, so that is true. They did put in 1. So I'm supposed to go run this video games. I have to go find a function called video games. Okay. So it comes down here and it finds video games. And it says, all right, so I'm supposed to print something. Now where does it go from here? Remember that when it's done running the last line of a function, it returns to whoever called it. Now where did this come from when we got here? Where were we before we first came to this function? Well, we were here, weren't we? Video games prompted us to move here. We printed out. And then the code will return back to wherever it came from. So it'll return here. If there was more lines of code afterwards, it would generate whatever's here. It would continue on from here. Then at the end of this particular line, of course, the else statement isn't going to render because the if was true. And so we get to the end of our if block, which is the end of our function. So now we return back to whoever called this function. And if you recall, this is the one that generated the call. So we came from here. So it's kind of like first in, first out. Wherever we came from, we come back the same direction we came from. So that's the order in which things are going to be run. So if let's do the other trail. Let's say that we run menu. And menu gets called, I'm sorry, not greeting. Menu gets called. We print, we print, we print. We get a value. Let's say this time it's 2. The if statement is going to condition false. So we're going to do the else. The movies is going to run. And here is our movies. So we're going to print something different from the movies. We return to where we came from, which was here at the end of movies. We are finished with this if block, which means we return to where we came from, which was here. And then if there was another line of code, then that line of code would be executed, whatever that line of statement is. Or in this case, I just made a function call to a function that doesn't exist yet. All right, so let me comment that out so I can test my code and make sure it's working. That is not a, there we go. Okay, so let's run this and test it. So we have 2 tests we want to test for. One if we put in a 1, and then another condition if we put in 0, anything else besides 1. So let's go ahead and run it. And the first time we will put in our name, and it's going to ask me where I want to go. I'm going to choose a 1 the first time, and let's see what happens. Wouldn't you prefer to go to a movie? That in fact printed. Then it came back to whoever called it. It printed the word here, which I left in. And then it returned back to whoever called it, which was menu. And that was the end of the program because we have no more valid statements after that function call. Okay, are you getting it? I hope so. So let's make our last and final function. We want to do a closing, and my idea with closing is that, let's see where I'm going to put, I'll put it right here. Define closing, and we'll just put a simple little, you know, thanks for playing kind of thing. Print, thank you for trying my program. Okay, there we go. And so I think we're good. Let's run this one more time just to make sure that, I'm going to close this just so we can get kind of a blank screen there, just to make sure that we're looking good. There we go. All right, so what is my name? I'm Kirsten still. And hello, Kirsten. Welcome to my program. What would you like to do today? Well, I want to go to the movie. So I'm going to put a 2. Did you know Star Wars is coming out? Thank you for trying my program. And if I run it a second time, I'm going to run it, and I'm still Kirsten. It doesn't know that. This time I'm going to choose a 1. And wouldn't you prefer to go to a movie? And then there's that little obligatory here I left in there. So this is our introduction to functions. We are seeing that each of these functions are short. They pertain just to the function name that we've assigned to them, so they're very easy to maintain. And kind of incidentally, I'll show you why this is so important. It makes sense that since we have, well, let's do this. I'm even going to change this up a little bit just to prove a point. Why are we, and we've talked about this before, but why are creating individual functions so important? Well, one, they're easier to maintain. They are easier to read. You can pretty much look in here and have a good idea that whatever is contained in this particular function has to do with video games, and this one has to do with movies. So it's easier to maintain. We're not going to have repetitive code, because anytime I want to do something with the movies, I can just call this particular function. And since this is the only place where movies is where I'm keeping the movie information, maybe maybe I don't want to print this anymore. Maybe what I want is, did you see it? Okay, that movie It? Yeah, well anyway, I didn't see it, but I heard it's pretty scary. So the idea here is, remember I had this kind of opposition to, I say, oh, I don't like video games. Well, maybe instead of sending them to video games, or after they print, wouldn't you prefer to go to a movie? Well, let's just send them to movies. Can I do that? Absolutely, I can. So now what I'm doing is just utilizing the same chunk of code over and over again by using the same function calls to that function. So that's another reason. You saw 2 reasons why this is creating functions is so important. One, it's easy to maintain because I can only have to change it in one place. And if I want to use this code in multiple places in my program, all I have to do is make a call to that function instead of writing repetitive code. Like this would be repetitive. If instead I said, you know, if instead of this, I said something like, oh, do you want to print, did you see it? And then, oh yeah, here's the movie thing. So I'm going to copy and paste that. So remember, I always talk about if you have repetitive code, find another way to do it so that you don't have repetitive code. And this is definitely repetitive. And so we don't want to do that. Instead, what we're doing is making a function call to a single place that's keeping track of all that code for us. So this is your introduction to functions, and in our next videos, we'll take this a step further and understand a little bit more about variables and how they work in our functions, as well as what goes into these parentheses. All right, we'll see you there.